September 1991. The Alps. At a glacier over 10,000 feet up, two hikers were walking along the melting ice when they suddenly saw part of a body sticking out, the skin gone dark brown. They assumed it was a climber who died in the mountains. So did the police. But the body was sent for testing. And when the result came back, everyone froze. This man had died about 5,300 years ago, older than the pyramids, and the world later named him Ötzi, the Iceman. And what this body was carrying will overturn everything you think you know about fire. You've seen the shot on YouTube: a survival expert crouches down, rubs two sticks together a few times, and fire appears. That part's true. Sticks really can make fire, and people have been doing it for tens of thousands of years. It's just that the footage always cuts out the most critical few minutes in the middle, and that's exactly where 9 out of 10 people fail. Here's the even more counterintuitive part. This 5,300-year-old Iceman is about to tell you himself, the people who truly lived by fire almost never started one. So what's really going on here? Let's go back to that ice. Researchers began cataloging what Ötzi was carrying: a copper axe, a flint knife, a bow and arrows, top-tier gear for his time. Then they opened a small pouch on his belt, and inside were pieces of processed tinder fungus, a mushroom that grows on birch trees, dried into the best fire-starting material of the era. The surface even tested positive for traces of pyrite. Strike pyrite against flint, and you get sparks. In other words, this was a 5,300-year-old lighter. But the thing that really stopped researchers cold was something else. A small birch bark container, lined with maple leaves, with traces of charcoal wrapped inside. Their reading was that this was for carrying fire, wrapping up a still smoldering coal and carrying it against the body. Which means this man carried two systems on him, one to start fire, one to keep it. Remember these two systems, because the answer to today's question is already written inside them. A man living 5,300 years ago with the best gear of his era chose to carry an extra pouch, tending a smoldering coal every single day, rather than start a fire from nothing. Why? Because he knew better than anyone exactly how expensive from nothing really was in his world. And that why is today's real story. So, how expensive was it exactly? The fastest way to find out is to hand it to you and let you try it yourself. Imagine you're living in his world. It rained last night. You wake up to find the fire dead, nothing left but a pile of soaked ash. It's cold. No fire means no cooked food, and you won't make it through the next night. Don't rush to rub sticks together yet. A real firemaker makes a whole string of choices first, and every one of them is a variable. Your fireboard needs to be soft, dry wood, cedar, willow, basswood, roughly a thumb thick. Too hard, and you get no dust. Too wet, and you only get smoke. Your spindle needs to be straight, about as thick as your thumb, and about a forearm's length. Too thin, and there's not enough pressure. Too thick, and it won't spin fast enough. And to check whether the wood is dry enough, the old test is: snap it. A clean crack means it's dry. A dull thud means there's still water inside. Throw it away. Once the materials are chosen, you cut a V-shaped notch into the edge of the fireboard. Don't underestimate this cut. It's the real core of the whole system, because the dust you're about to grind needs somewhere to fall and pile up. Dust. That's the real target here. The goal was never to heat the wood, it was to make dust, and get that small pile of dust as hot as it could possibly get. Then you wrap the bowstring around the spindle, your left hand pressing down on the top, your right hand sawing the bow back and forth. The spindle spins. Wood grinds against wood. A minute in, your arm starts to ache. Sweat drips down, but you cannot stop, because the heat is building up bit by bit. And if you stop even once, everything you've done resets to zero, and right when you're about to give out, white smoke appears. And this is when you push harder, not slower, grinding until the smoke thickens before you dare to stop. Then you look down at that small pile of black dust, and at its center is a single point, glowing dull red. That's not a flame. That's an ember. A speck, a few hundred degrees hot, small as a seed. A gust of wind kills it. Breathing too hard kills it. You tip it gently into a bird's nest made of dry grass and bark fiber. Then cup the whole nest to your face and blow, long and steady. The smoke thickens until it stings your eyes. And then, with a soft pop, fire appears. So survival shows never lied. Sticks really can make fire. It's just that flame is never rubbed into existence, it's fed into existence. Ember feeds tinder. Tinder feeds twigs. Twigs feed logs, each layer feeding the next. Tip a layer and the fire dies. But that's the version where everything goes right. In reality, a fireboard that's even slightly damp gets you 30 minutes of smoke and nothing else. Sweat drips onto the board, and you're back to zero, so the real skill of this craft was never in the rubbing, it was in what happens before. Dry wood, gathered 3 days in advance, tinder prepared ahead of time. Now, A different question. If someone does every single step right, are they safe? In 1908, the legendary American writer Jack London, who wrote The Call of the Wild and White Fang, published a short story called To Build a Fire, which American classrooms still teach today. London himself had prospected for gold in the Yukon and nearly died there, so the cold in his writing is cold he actually lived through. In the story, a man is traveling alone through the Yukon at 75 below zero, and he breaks through river ice, soaking his foot. At that temperature, a wet foot is a countdown to death, and he knows it, so he stops immediately to build a fire. Tinder, twigs, flame, and sure enough, the fire catches. Every step done right. But he built it under a spruce tree, and the branches above were loaded with snow. The rising heat loosened that snow, and right then, the whole sheet of it came crashing down from the tree, landing squarely on the fire. The fire died. By that point, his fingers were already too frozen to strike a second match. In the story's ending, the man dies in the snow. His dog walks off, alive. The story is fiction, but what it's telling you is real. What killed him wasn't his fire-making technique, it was the location. The first step of fire-making actually happens before you crouch down. Look up first. Check whether there are snow-loaded branches above you, check where the wind is coming from, and check whether the ground is wet. And if you're on snow, you need to lay down a platform of logs first and build the fire on top of it, otherwise, once the fire really gets going, it melts the snow beneath it and drowns itself. So the technique was right, the location was right, that should be enough, shouldn't it? There's one more layer, buried even deeper. In August 1911, outside a slaughterhouse in a small California town, people surrounded a man, starving and worn down to nothing, who didn't understand a word of English. The story made national news within days. Reporters gave him a sensational name, the last wild Indian in America, and his name was Ishi, the final living member of the Yahi people, a tribe wiped out by massacre, disease, and starvation, leaving him to hide alone in the hills for decades. In anthropologists' records, Ishi demonstrated how his people made fire, using the hand drill, no bow at all, just his two palms pressing the spindle and spinning it downward, then bringing his hands back to the top and spinning again. It's the hardest of all the friction methods, and yet Ishi could produce fire in a matter of minutes. So where did the difference actually come from? Not from strength. The records are clear on this. He was extremely selective about materials. Which plant stem could be a spindle? Which wood could be a fireboard? What season to harvest it in? How to store it afterward? Every detail mattered. So the few minutes he spent spinning were only the very last step. Standing behind those few minutes was thousands of years of material knowledge, carried by an entire people. And around the world, every culture handed in its own answer. Polynesians used the fire plow, pushing a stick hard along a wooden groove to grind out dust. Ancient Egypt left behind actual bow drill artifacts. Ötzi's system of flint and pyrite later evolved into striking flint against steel. It was paired with something essential, char cloth, cotton baked inside a sealed tin, cut off from air, until it turns completely black, able to catch even the faintest spark and start smoldering instantly. Flint, steel, char cloth, packed into a small tin box, that's the fire kit that sat on humanity's bedside table for 200 years. Nearly every American pioneer carried one. Southeast Asia went a step further, inventing the fire piston. A sealed bamboo tube, and slamming a plunger down hard compresses the air inside so suddenly that it ignites the tinder at the bottom by itself. Today, every diesel engine on Earth runs on that same exact principle. Going back further still, Greek comedy from over 400 years BC already describes someone using a lens to focus sunlight into fire. And in 1903, the Austrian chemist Karl Auer von Welsbach invented ferrocerium, the same alloy in every lighter's flint, and every fire striker sold in survival stores today, throwing off sparks at high temperatures and working even when wet. Speaking of wet, that's exactly the real dividing line between veterans and beginners, bad weather. After it rains, every piece of wood on the forest floor is wet. So what do? First, don't pick up wood off the ground, go find standing dead branches. The ones hanging up off the ground, rain doesn't soak all the way through, and the core stays dry. Snap it, and you'll know by the sound. Second, go find birch. Birch bark peels off paper thin and lights even when its surface is damp, because the bark itself is full of oil. Third, find a wounded pine tree. The resin that oozes out and hardens inside the wood, shave off a piece and it burns slowly, like a candle. And if you can't even find fine tinder, take a dry branch and shave it with a knife, curl after curl, without cutting the curls off, leaving them attached to the branch like feathers. This is called a feather stick, the standard move for firemaking in wet weather. Modern survivalists also have a shortcut. Touch steel wool to both terminals of a battery, and it bursts into flame instantly. A 9-volt battery is all you need. But sitting above all of these techniques is one rule that's tens of thousands of years old. Once you have fire, don't let it die. At night, bury the coals under ash so they smolder slowly until morning. Traveling far, wrap the coals in slow-burning fungus or bark and carry them with you, just like the container on Ötzi's belt. And if the fire really does go out, You go borrow one from the next village. In many societies, fire was a resource shared by the whole community, and letting it die out wasn't something you could shrug off as an accident. It was a matter serious enough to mean a long walk, head bowed, to go beg for fire back. Humans have used fire for hundreds of thousands of years. But for nearly every generation, starting a fire was the last resort. Keeping it alive was the daily job. And that's what today's title actually means. It's not that ancient people didn't know how to start fire. It's that they understood exactly how expensive it was, and poured their effort into keeping the fire alive instead. Then, time moved forward to 1827, to a small English town, where a pharmacist named John Walker sold the first box of friction matches that April, according to his own ledger. A wooden stick with a chemical coating on the tip struck once against a rough surface, and flame appeared just like that. No ember, no tinder nest, no breath required. A problem that had troubled humanity for tens of thousands of years solved by a stick worth 1 penny. Walker never patented it, and within decades, matches had spread across the entire world. Of course, convenience came with a cost. Early matches used white phosphorus, and the women working in match factories developed rotting, decaying jawbones from the fumes. That cost was paid by people nobody saw, and that's another forgotten story. And right after that, something very quiet happened. That skill died. Your great-great-great-grandfather's generation might still have known how to strike flint against steel. 2 generations further down, no one remembered how. A body of knowledge that humanity had carried for tens of thousands of years vanished from collective memory in about the span of a single generation. So, if you ever find yourself somewhere with no lighter, this story leaves you 5 things. 1. Look up before you crouch down. More people die from choosing the wrong location than from bad technique. 2. Fire is a chain: ember, tinder, twigs, logs, each layer feeding the next. Skip a layer and it dies. 3. In wet weather, remember to look for 3 things: standing dead branches, birch bark, resin-soaked pine. 4. Gather every material before you strike your first spark. An ember only gives you 1 chance. 5. Once you have fire, protect it. Starting over is always harder than you'd think. Finally, let's go back to that mountain one more time. Ötzi never walked down. There was a flint arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder. That's another story. But his belt pouch survived. The tinder fungus, the traces of pyrite, and that birch bark container built to carry an ember. 5,300 years later, each piece now sits one by one under the lights of a museum. And the lighter in your pocket, worth about $1, is the one thing tens of thousands of generations of humans wanted most. Someone once carried fire against their own body like it was life itself. Now, fire is right there in your pocket, and you've probably never looked at it twice.